Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Happy Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. We are halfway through Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is probably my favorite holiday, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm very lazy, actually, as a person. If you don't know that about me, and Hanukkah is just like so easy. It's just like the most bang for your buck. I love Hanukkah because you just like light the candles and say a few prayers. You're done. And just hang out all week. So I love Hanukkah. Hanukkah is also a great time to talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is clothing, which may seem like a bit of a random topic. Obviously, it's not that random. Everybody on this call has clothing on, right? It is a part of our at least so far as I can tell. If you're in my second page, when you're in black and white, maybe it's because you're naked. But if you show your video, you probably have put some clothes on, and we do this every day, and it's a thought process for most of us every day. And some of us care a lot about it, and some of us don't care that much at all. And actually, that's a good place to start thinking about clothing. I think clothing it seems a little random, but I think it's a fascinating topic in religious life altogether. Of course, we could start thinking about particular kinds of religious clothing and the symbolism of religious clothing, but I'm just thinking more about what it means to dress well, to dress nicely, to care about dress, or not to care at all. And I was just talking about this with Carrie, who's running our thanks to Carrie, who's running our show today. Carrie, my colleague, I was just talking about this yesterday, and we were just talking about days when we dress up, dress nicer, care about and then other days when we don't care. And I was saying that this reflects actually a debate in the world of Musar, of the Jewish ethical movement, personal self-development movement that emerged in the 18th century. And there were different schools of thought around how one pushes oneself to that kind of personal development, how one pushes oneself to be better. And that really is the language of Musar. Some people like it, some people don't, but it's like to better yourself. And one of the schools of thought, famous schools of Musar, is the Novartic School. And they were very much a kind of a self-punishing, like a kind of I am nothing, I am worthless was like one of the kind of credos of that, self-diminishing. And one of the manifestations of that, and you'll find it in Christian tradition and in all kinds of spiritual traditions, is that they would wear ratty clothes, as if to say, I don't care about my body, I don't care about my physical, nothing, like, who cares about me? It's not about me. And after all, we place so much status and emphasis on clothes and appearance and the way that ties into, well, you can see a whole critique there, right? It's a legitimate critique. It may be taken to extremes, but it's a legitimate critique. And then on the other side, you have the school of Slobodka, and the author of Slobodka, the great Rabbi of Slobodka, taught that that a person should, and again, thinking about the full development of the human being, how do we develop ourselves? How do we push ourselves to be our best? His philosophy was very much that we are emissaries of God. We are made in the image of God. We are royalty. We are divine beings, and we should dress the part. And the Novartic, the Slobodka schools were known for rabbis that dressed very elegantly, almost as if they were princes, and they were very meticulous in their dress. And it was a part of that philosophy, as if to say, part of my religious life is that I dress nicely. And on some level, we probably all are familiar with that too. We do dress nicely when we go to shul, when we go to maybe if not Shabbat, Ikar's pretty casual. Maybe Rosh Hashanah, we dress a little bit. I wear a tie on Rosh Hashanah. It's like to set that distinction. So what's that all about? What's that all about? Where are our values there as Jews, as people of faith, as people of ethics, as people who are asking those Musar questions? How do I be? How can I be my best self in the world? Does this have anything to do with it? right? When we so often think of clothes in a more frivolous way, like it's just fashion, it's just like prettiness. But is it just that, or is it something more? Hanukkah, as I said, is a great time to ask that question, because a lot of the struggle in the backdrop of Hanukkah is not between Jews and Greeks, but between Jews who are trying to be a little more Greek and Jews who were against that attempt. And Josephus writes about this, about the way, Josephus, the ancient historian, writes about the way that Jews wanted to look like Greeks, and they would do everything they could, even, he says, attend to their circumcision, try to grow it back, which is like sort of horrifying. But you can only imagine what they wore, what they dressed like, what Greek fashion was. And after all, Greek culture at the time was the kind of the paragon of beauty as an ethic, as a value, right? And rabbis were looking at that and wondering about that and thinking about that. So Hanukkah is a good time to think about that as well. And as we'll soon see, the story of Joseph is a good place to think about it. So we'll get into that. Let's say a blessing over our learning, a blessing over, we bless physical things in this tradition, right? Like Malbish Arumim, God who clothes the naked, and we bless our food, but we also bless spiritual things in our tradition. So we bless this opportunity to sit and study Torah together.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right. So I was struck by all of this as I opened this week's Parsha and started to read, and very quickly I saw this line. I'm going to share the sheet with you in a minute, but I just want to show you the line that caught my eye first, and then realize that there's so much more here. And the line that caught my eye is at the beginning of this week's Parsha. Pharaoh dreams his dreams, 2 dreams. And there's all kinds of dreams is, maybe the most interesting motif in these last parshot. But as we'll soon see, close, that's a good word, is one of the motifs we find in this story. And so I noticed when Pharaoh dreams his dreams, and then one of his attendants says, hey, when I was in prison, I met a guy who could interpret dreams. And that's Joseph, and that's Joseph's key to success, and that's that's why he's pulled out of the dungeon, and quickly why he rises to great power in Egypt. But as he is pulled out of the dungeon there, Pharaoh says, okay, let's talk to this guy. I want to hear who's so good at interpreting dreams. As he's pulled out of the dungeon, you notice this line: Veishlach Paro v'yikra et Yosef vayritzuhu min habor. Pharaoh sent someone to call Joseph, and he was rushed from the dungeon. He was taken up from out of the pit, literally. His hair was cut. His hair was cut. That could actually also mean shaved. So his face was shaved, his hair was cut, something was cut. Vaichalef simlotav, and his clothes were changed. Vaichalef simlotav, his clothes were changed. We're going to look at a few words for clothes in this class, but one of them is simla, which in modern Hebrew is like a dress, but it's used in the Torah to mean your clothes, what you put on, your dress. His clothes were changed, vayavo el paro, and he came before Pharaoh. Okay, so we're gonna do a lot with this. We're gonna try and layer this and unpack layers and add new layers. We're gonna try to go as far as we can with Joseph's clothes. But this line itself, which is maybe the least prominent of the Joseph clothing stories, it gives us a phrase which I think is important for thinking about Joseph's life. Vaichalef simlotav, and he changed his clothes. He changed his clothes, and he's always changing his clothes. He's always changing. This is a guy who has a lot of costume changes, right? If you were staging the story of Joseph, and by the way, the story of Joseph has been staged, and they called it Joseph and the, Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? Joseph's story is almost like a story of costume changes, right from the start, as we'll soon see. But let's just take a moment. We're going to try and be in Parshat Mikeitz this week's Parsha. So we're going to focus especially on the moments of kind of costume change that we see here. So let's just take a moment with this one. Comes up out of the pit, prison. So either prison clothes or just probably in those days, just disgusting clothes. And he has he shaved and a haircut, 2 bits, and he has his clothes changed. And I really only have one question this entire, I try to prepare good questions, but I don't have good questions. I'm mostly just going to keep asking you, like, what's the deal with the clothes? What's the significance of the clothing change? I want to ask that again and again, and just asking that question will do us a lot of good, because there are many moments to ask it. But just to give one sense of what might be going on here, and it's not a complicated sense, but it's the one that Rashi gives us, and therefore it's the one that is very well known. And he actually comments on the haircut, but it could be true for the clothing as well, is that his hair was cut mipnei kavod hamalchut, out of honor or out of respect for the king, for royalty. Okay, that's why his clothing was changed. In other words, Rashi is wondering, why do you have to tell us little details like, and he was preparing on the way and he changed it? It seems, again, clothing seems on one level to be so prosaic and kind of and not deep as a topic. And yet there it is, the Torah is signaling it. So Rashi wants to know why. And what he says is, Joseph changed his clothes and cut his hair out of respect for royalty. Now, maybe that's a good place to start. What is Rashi saying there? What does it mean that you would dress in a certain way out of respect for royalty? What, if I may use too lofty a phrase, what philosophy of clothing is embedded in that Rashi? Or dress up for Rosh Hashanah, or dress up for President Obama, or dress up for, like what does it mean to get dressed up for royalty, for the respect of royalty? And I guess as I asked that question to you, does that sound right? Do you agree with that value? Do you feel like it's important to get dressed up on certain occasions? Okay? Let's start there. Judy?
The first thing that came to my mind was respect. It's like dressing a table for Passover. You're not going to use necessarily paper plates for Passover, but you would want to use, dress a table neatly and respectfully. And the word respect comes to my mind too. For the high holidays, you wouldn't want to walk in with oil all over your clothes, let's say. There is something to that respect for the people, respect for the holiday.
Great. Okay, great. So Judy very beautifully focuses on the word that Rashi uses, kavod. Kavod, respect, honor. And that is surely a value in this tradition, to show honor, at least to God. A little funny, do we also show honor to kings? Interesting, but Judy's describing, well, whatever the Jewish value system is, we know as human beings that there are certain occasions where dressing up shows that we respect the space, we respect the occasion. When we go to a wedding, we dress up because we're acknowledging that this is a wonderful event and I'm dressing to the event. Now, very well put. I guess I would just respond. It's easy, and I'm doing this a little bit as a caricature, but it's easy to respond and say, you can construct the other extreme and say, what does it matter? That's vanity. Hevel havalim, it's all vanity. Who cares about? Respect is through action. Respect is through love. Respect is through words. Respect is through prayer. What do clothes have to do with it? What do the physical, visual, surface level things, you might say, have to do with honor? Couldn't we do without that that visual marker of some kind of status? Okay. All right. So the debate begins to be framed. Noah, what do you think?
I think that the constant use of clothes in regard to Joseph is very interesting, because elsewhere in the Torah it says God vests himself with the clothing of something or other. And even I see it as a sign of respect for the king, for God, but there's also that element that maybe his constant changes are marks of more assimilation into the culture, and that he's trying to respect his beliefs as well as the others, but there's so much going on maybe inside and outside that he's buying into the assimilation into Egypt, into the Egyptian royalty, whatever, and there he's might be showing more respect for the culture and not that much for his heritage at different times.
That's a very nice point to make as a kind of a forking off from what Judy was just saying. That is, yes, indeed, clothing shows honor, respect, acknowledgement for a social context. So then Noah wonders, well, what kind of honor are you showing? Well, and I alluded to that myself. Should you be honoring the Pharaoh? I mean, now look, it looks like Joseph didn't have much choice here. In fact, the verbs are in the passive. He was shaved and he was dressed. So, okay, maybe Joseph's not responsible for it, but we will soon see Joseph become Egyptian royalty and to take on all of the trappings of Egyptian finery. And at that point, we begin to wonder, Noah begins to wonder, and he's right, it's a central theme in the Joseph story, how much he is converting, let's say, over to Egyptian, to Egyptianness, to becoming an Egyptian. And do his clothes reflect that transition? One of the great midrashic teachings around clothing is that the children of Israel were rewarded because they didn't change their religion, their language, or their clothes in Egypt. There are different versions of that, but one is that you don't change your clothes. Now Joseph did, but maybe the slaves in Egypt, they kept their Jewish garments. You know, I have this image in my mind from the Ten Commandments. You know, when Moses, the movie. You know, when Moses, baby Charlton Heston, is wrapped in the cloth, and you get the feeling there's something distinctive about that cloth that signals that this is a Hebrew baby. So clothing becomes a choice to participate in one culture or another, and that's fraught, especially for a people that's always anxious about assimilation, about the loss of cultural integrity. So, you know, there we begin to think about the Haredi approach, which is to make sure not to dress like the culture around you, even though it's totally permitted to wear blue jeans. You don't wear blue jeans because that's Goya shit. That's just not, that's them. And you have to signal that you're you. There's nothing wrong with wearing jeans. You just have to keep, so it's very fraught. It's very fraught, to say the least. Estra, you want to pick up on this?
Oh yeah, I just want to say I left my Strymel in the coat closet, but Strymels are expensive. Anyways, I really appreciate this conversation, especially as a community that lives in Los Angeles, because it's a place where it just feels like there's so many celebrities and people who may not be celebrities, but they dress like they're royalty. So I think it's just feels like such a meaningful conversation to have, especially because I guess the one thing that came to my mind is, okay, what's been my own journey with clothing and my own appearance, and this idea of like dressing up for royalty. It's like, God, you know, like living in LA, it feels like you need to dress up for LA. You know, there's this kind of pressure of looking good, but on the other hand, feels like there's more freedom here. Like, you know, in Connecticut, it was like, am I really going to wear red lipstick or the color red? But I feel more empowered to do that in Los Angeles. So my thoughts about, okay, Yosef dressing up for royalty, is it for the royalty, but is it also for how we feel about ourselves? I guess that's what I'm finding myself reflecting on, which is like, I'm dressing up to help myself feel more confident after a lot of ugly duckling syndrome maybe in the past, and like not feeling confident. Like maybe the way we dress ourselves is not just so we feel accepted or approved or assimilated enough, but also just to feel like better about ourselves, regardless of who like the gaze is fixated on, you know. So and then also like this notion of separately in terms of musar, like how our behaviors are like a type of, or actions are a type of how we dress ourselves. Because you ever see someone who looks like really put together, but they're acting like a total douche, and you're like, oh my gosh, like that's not attractive anymore. So like our musar is maybe our clothing too.
Yeah, okay, wonderful, Esther. Thank you so much for bringing it in, really into our contemporary culture, really here in LA. And I think those of us who live in LA do feel what you're alluding to. You know, I moved down from the Bay Area, same state, but what a different fashion image culture. So that all of those issues they're fraught in the ancient Jewish story. They're fraught today looking at the cover of Vogue and the way that all of this plays into our consciousness in exciting, fun, but also sometimes destructive, dangerous ways. Right? I'm just alluding to things that you all know, but I'll give you one way that this plays out in my own family. I told you about the ancient, or not the ancient, but the older Musar debate, like different ethical schools of thought around clothing. But in my own family, it takes place in just the debate that my brother and I sometimes have. My brother, who is a really great dresser, like a real bona fide hipster. And I said something to him like, oh, I hope that when I get older, I don't care about what I wear anymore. As I get older, I should stop. That's the goal, to be 80 and to be just not think about your clothing at all, because it's all socially negotiated. That was my position. My brother said, no, God forbid. I want to be 80. And the 80-year-olds that I like are the ones that, the real dandies, the ones that are still keeping up. And he said, because it shows they're still alive, they still care, they're still trying to look, and there's something noble and beautiful about that. So you can see how the same kind of behavior can be cast in very different ways with almost like moral language attached to them. Okay, so Esra helps us to bring this conversation really into our contemporary landscape. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more comments. I can see that now we don't need any more text, right? We could just do this. Everybody has something to say about clothing, which shows that I see a row of hands. I want to take a couple more comments, and then I just want to quickly give us more material, because maybe not everyone here is so aware of how shot through the Joseph story is, or threaded through, if I may, with clothing imagery. So I want to explore that motif, but we've got so many hands up that let's keep taking, because we're getting great stuff from the group's interpretation. So let's turn to Stephen and then Matt, and then we'll take a little break and look at some more text, and then we'll take more hands. So Stephen.
Thanks. So you could come here to Ohio and dress any way you want at 40. You don't have to wait till 80. It's interesting to think about it from a contemporary perspective, but I'm not sure that necessarily helps us, because when we think of the possibility of changing clothes to whatever we want, it doesn't really apply historically, in which what you could wear was often determined, if not by custom, then by law. And so sumptuary laws would determine whether you could wear a certain cloth, whether you could wear a certain thread, whether you could wear a certain color. And all of these would be your external markers of who you were in terms of religion, who you were in terms of class, who you were in terms of marital status. All of these things were determined. And so the choices you had in clothes were very constrained and very marked by your social conditions. So the contemporary is really interesting, but I'm not sure it necessarily gives us into the ancient of what that might have been.
Excellent and an important point that Stephen makes. Thank you so much for that, because I wasn't thinking about that at all, but you're exactly right. The way I was speaking kind of naturally out of my own experience is that our relationship to clothing is a choiceful relationship. We pick out clothes. Stephen is so right that even in our own world, but certainly in the ancient world, we often don't choose the clothes we wear either because of economic limitation or because a certain social setting mandates, either through great social pressure or actually by law, that we wear certain things, right? Jewish law has rules for me, has rules for women, has rules for men, has rules for kids, has rules like what, you know, so let's not get carried away in thinking about its self-expression. Clothes are socially, we've talked about the way they play into a social order, but that social order is often the one that is dressing us, right? Okay, Matt, so we're saying.
I have so much to say. I'm going to try to make it really quick. So one, and to that last point, this has been a debate for my entire life of breaking down precisely those social rules, that your clothes determined where you were in society. And we've changed that. The fact that you can wear jeans to the Academy Awards, as it were, was a social revolution. So yes, that's very modern. I want to say, just very personal, I don't know that I have an innate notion of respecting things, and I've learned it and I've tried to do it. So I make sure I dress nicely when I go to ECAR. I make sure I know it's acceptable for me to wear shorts and stuff, and that there are people who do and they're comfortable, but I don't, because I need to make sure I'm saying I'm respectful of this space. So it's very direct. And then I just want to go to where you're headed. It seems to me that Joseph, again, is almost a trickster like Jacob, in that he keeps changing who he is by his clothes. He keeps becoming a different person, and the Torah keeps making his clothes. And I know that when he sees his brothers, doesn't he, they make a thing that he's putting on all this stuff, because he's not Joe, he's this other person. He's a shape changer, becoming different people. So it's very much surface and ephemeral and meaningless and absolutely real and absolutely critical.
Great. Okay, that's great. So first of all, I just want to remind us of the first point that Matt made, which is so interesting and important in this moment in time, which is that we are, as a society, in the middle of a great kind of we have more wealth, right, than previous generations, but we don't dress as formally. We're in the move towards casual dress, where you can wear jeans to the Academy Awards or to IKAR, or just walking around, you just walk around in your pajamas, and that's sanctioned, and it's not, you're not a freak. And I'm grateful for that. But one question that it raises is whether or not something's been lost. My father would certainly say something's been lost. He used to take me to the baseball game, and he would say, used to look around here and every man was wearing a hat, you know, and that was like, in his eye, it was like a beautiful thing. Like everybody wearing now I don't want to have to wear a fedora every day, but there was something kind of regal about that. So we are in a different moment with that. Okay, that's an important thing to think about as well, as we're sort of just reflecting on the place of clothes in our own lives and consciousness. And I presume there's much more in here in the crowd, much more wisdom on that topic. But Matt did me a favor by pointing us again to the Joseph story. And one of the core questions that we're asking today is why clothes are in fact a motif in the Joseph story in particular. What is it about Joseph that the Torah wants to explore, to examine, to highlight through the motif of clothing? And so let's just take just a few minutes. This is a different kind of class. I'm just like throwing texts at you, and then we're coming back again and again to one basic question, which is like, why is this so important? What's this all about? But Matt reminds us that we got to get back into the Joseph story a little bit so that we all have the material in front of us. Here, I haven't shared the source sheet with you yet. Here it is. Let's just go back one Parsha where we kind of met Joseph. Parshat Vayeshev is where Joseph's story starts. And probably most of you know that it begins with that Technicolor Dreamcoat, that coat of many colors. That's one of the first things we learn about Joseph. So let's just take a look at some of those key reference points. Okay, now this is the beginning of Joseph's story. now Israel loved Yisrael ahavet Yosef mikol banav. Israel loved Joseph best of all of his sons. Now that's going to be the big problem, favoritism, and because he was the child of his old age. Va'asalo ketonet pasim, and he had made him an ornamented cloak. There are many ways to translate both of these words: a tunic, a coat, a cloak. This is the word that the high priest will eventually use for the Torah will use for one of the high priest garments. So some kind of outer covering, and it had pasim on it, which means stripes or decorations or patterns. But this is the famous thing that Jacob gave Joseph, the Technicolor dream coat, and importantly, vayiru achav, and his brothers saw. What did they see? They saw the coat. Well, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, and they hated him. So they couldn't speak a friendly word to him. Okay, so right from the start, Joseph and the drama of the Joseph story and the tension of the Joseph story, Joseph being favored, being obnoxious, being hated, being in conflict with his brothers, it all begins with this special gift of the coat. And then when it explodes later in the chapter with enough anger to motivate the brothers to seize Joseph and to throw him in a pit and eventually to sell him to slavery in Egypt, for God's sake, the first thing they do is that they strip Joseph of his cloak. Of course they do. They hated that cloak. They hated seeing that cloak. So they strip it off of him and then they cast him in the pit. Right? The Torah really makes mention of that. And then, if that weren't enough, they take the cloak. That cloak, talk about a symbolic ritual here. They take the cloak and they dip it into blood and they show it to their father to say, oh, look, Joseph died. Is this Joseph's tunic? Here I've translated as tunic, but before I translated as cloak. So let me correct that. Cloak. My son's cloak. Look, the word just comes up again and again and again, and Jacob recognizes it, and it is the very symbol of Joseph, that cloak. And the brothers strip him of that, and they dip it into blood. Okay, so that's one major reference point for us, is that ketonet pasim, that cloak, that coat of many colors that Joseph got, that began the whole cycle of jealousy and rage and violence. And okay, so that's one thing to make mention of. The other great clothing story from last week's Parsha, and then I'll open the conversation back up, is that Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, and he becomes a slave in the house of Potiphar, and he does very well there, except that the Potiphar's wife takes a shine to him. By the way, as an aside, probably because Potiphar was a eunuch and couldn't have sex, right? So like, just to get a little bit into the backstory of what might be going on there. But anyway, the woman of the house wants to sleep with Joseph, says she wants to sleep with Joseph, tries to get him to sleep with her. He refuses, right? It's not some debate around how much he wanted to, but he refuses ultimately. And then the great drama happens when she forces herself on him, and does so by grabbing his clothes. So let's take a look now, and we're going to get yet another word for clothing, the one that's probably most familiar to modern speakers of Hebrew, which is beged, clothing. Okay, so let's take a look here, and then we'll open it back up again. So one day Joseph came into the house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. She caught hold of him by his garment, the big dough, and said, lie with me, sleep with me. But he got away, but he left his garment in her hand, right? That's that word again, beged. And he got away and he fled outside. And when she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called to her servants and said to him, look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. That's a kind of archaic translation. But look, they brought us a Hebrew to mess with us, to play with us. And this one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. She blames it on Joseph. But for our purposes, it's a complicated and interesting story. But for our purposes, just take note of how central the clothes, how central a role that these garments play in this story. He left his garment with me. She kept his garment beside her until Potiphar came home. And she said, look, look, this is the garment that I seized when Joseph tried to assault me. And she shows it to Potiphar the same way that Joseph's sons showed it, the coat of many colors, to Joseph's father. So echo, 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 motif, motif, motif. You can see that clothes are playing a very central role in almost all of the Joseph stories, okay? So again, now it isn't just Joseph kind of getting ready or being dressed up for the king or assimilating. Clothes are now the object of affection. Clothes are now the object of recognition, of identification. Clothes are mark some kind of status in a family. And of course, clothes and the lack of clothes have a sexual connotation, right? Like clothes are that which can cover or can reveal. And they play a role, if only in a literary way. The Torah is referring back to clothes, clothes, clothes here. But I wonder if there's more to it than that. So now you have more clothing reference points here. And so I think you at this point are well enough convinced that it is in fact a motif. That when we see Joseph change his clothes once again at the beginning of this week's Parsha, we think, oh my goodness, Joseph's been changing his clothes quite a lot, right? On and off and on and off and in all kinds of different ways. So with that, I return to the crowd again to think broadly about clothing, but also specifically in the way that Matt was doing about why clothes are so important to this man, right? So the phrase I used for this class, clothes make the man. I don't usually choose such a gendered title, but I did in this case because I wanted to quote Mark Twain, and I didn't realize, do some of you know the end of that quote? It's a Mark Twain quote, and he said, clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence on society. So that's like Mark Twain's like classic wit there, right? But in Joseph's case, it's really true. Clothes are kind of making every piece of his appearance in the story. So back to you. What do you make of this motif? Why is it so prominent in the Joseph story? So I'll turn first to Florine.
Oh my God. I could speak hours on this because that's what I train in, clothing cross-culturally and colors cross-culturally, in particular in literature. I want to go back to something Isra said because I think it might explain Joseph at some times in his life. And I want to talk about not dressing necessarily for the outside, but dressing for the inside. And when I wear white, all white, at different holidays, something happens to me. It's inside. So it's conceivable that at different times in one's life, what one wears or doesn't wear is not always dictated from the outside.
Great. Okay, so Florine, very, in her classic style, takes us to a deeper place and thinking, or an inner place. And that's right. I mean, that's part of what we have to think about in the Joseph story. And Matt was alluding to this also, is the way that Joseph is constantly, his story seems to be about like negotiating how much of his inner self is reflected in his outer self. And that becomes a big part of this story. How much do Joseph's clothes express who he is? And how much do Joseph's clothes conceal who he is? And Florine reminds us that our choices for different clothing, it isn't just about fitting social context. It may express something deep about who we are, how we feel, what is inside of us. And of course, clothes can mask that as well. They can betray. And in fact, one of the great nuances of the Hebrew is that the word beged is related to the word for betrayal, livgod, to betray, to deceive. So clothes can be as the Hebrew language understands, it can be a kind of a concealing, a betrayal, a deceiving. And there's so much deceiving in the Joseph story that surely the clothes are echoing that theme in the story as well. Okay. Leah Matsui.
Okay. I think we have to go back to original deception of Jacob in wolf's clothing, in goat clothing, to trick his father Isaac. We're going to see that again now. Okay, he then has a son Joseph. We see ornamental cloak. Then how does that cloak end up? Soaked in goat blood. Okay. Then there's a change again where he becomes now, we're getting into this right at this point, purely Egyptian. And then it's stolen from him. Well, not stolen, it's ripped from him by Potiphar's wife as evidence of his guilt. So we have sex, power, violence. I got a list here. All mixed up in clothing and trickery. That's how Isaac is tricked, because he smells and he feels that goat skin. That's how then Jacob is tricked, because he's handed the ornamental tunic inundated with goat blood. And so what a theme.
Yeah, that you're doing a great job of really map. Yeah, sorry, finish.
Yeah, we have to go back to, I would say, the original trickery.
The original trickery of Jacob. And that's right. I mean, that is Jacob, who looks identical to his brother, nevertheless needs to dress up like his brother in order to have his father misrecognize him. And the trickery is the right word here, because clothing then right from the start seemed to indicate a kind of deception, a kind of trickery, a way that you can look like someone you are not. And so when Joseph is ultimately cloaked in not just his family fineries, right, but in the fineries of Egyptian royalty, and then goes on to trick his brothers and deceive his brothers, we hear all of these echoes of the way that trickery has been executed through disguise, through costume in this story, right? So we've alluded to it a couple of times. I think it might be worth, and then we'll have all of the material that we need, well, all the major reference points. But let's take a look now at the, this is also in this week's Parsha, the kind of the grand scene that almost like the culmination of Joseph's dressing up throughout these various episodes. The grand scene where Joseph is appointed second in charge of all of Egypt, and look at how, right, he was shaved and dressed for royalty. But what happens when he becomes royalty? It is quite extravagant indeed. So take a look at the other great clothing scene from our, where am I? Oh, here we are. The other great clothing scene from our Parsha. Pharaoh said further to Joseph, see, I put you in charge of all the land of Egypt. Now that's a big deal. Now, Vayasar Paro et tabato me'al yado. He took his ring off of his hand, whether that's a form of clothing or something distinct is for you to consider. Vayitenota al yad Yosef, and he put it on Joseph's hand. Vayalbeshoto bigdei shesh, and he dressed him in garments of fine linen. Vayasem revid hazahav al tzavaro, and he put a gold chain about his neck. That's interesting. Jewelry. Is jewelry a part of clothing? We've seen jewelry before, right? Rebecca was dressed up in jewelry when Eliezer went to go and make her an offer, right? But here, about his neck feels like it could go either way. Is that good for Joseph, or is it actually a chain around his neck? And then just to finish out the scene, he had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried before him, Avrech. That seems to mean I bless you, and that was what they yelled out to royalty. Thus he placed him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, yet without you no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And then, right, you have to see this. If we're thinking about Joseph dressed in ways that are foreign, well, we have to think about the fact that he's also given a foreign name. Pharaoh then gave Joseph the name Tzafnat Paneach, and he gave him for a wife Osnat, Bat Potiphera, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So a foreign name, a foreign wife, a foreign chain and ring, and then of course we now imagine Joseph looking like a pharaoh. And in fact, if you Google, as I did to get an image for this class, Joseph in Egypt, a lot of the images come up are just like, they look like King Tut, right? Like imagine one of our ancestors, Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the Righteous, dressed like King Tut. And okay, now things have really reached an apex in terms of, and many of you have been alluding to it all along, Joseph really almost becomes Egyptian through his clothing, right? So, okay, I asked the question again. So what does this mean about who Joseph is? Why is this so prominent in the Joseph story? Okay, let's see how many people we can get to before we close. I'll turn to Jen.
All right. So I'm actually interpreting this and seeing themes connecting of Joseph's lack of power and lack of privilege. He's the youngest son. He's in each anecdote, first he's the youngest son, then he's a prisoner, then he's a slave, then he's being given conditional power that can always be taken away from him. And where I got there was thinking about my relationship to clothing versus my wife's, right? My wife is brown, I'm white. My wife grew up poor, I grew up upper middle class. I'm thinner than my wife. And when we go somewhere fancy, it is way more important to her to dress well than it is to me. It's way easier for me to say, I'll just wear jeans to this. And not for her, because she has to be seen as good enough, as valuable enough to guard and protect herself from her vulnerability, from her relative lack of privilege connected to me. And that seems to me to be what Joseph is doing either for himself or people are doing for him, is using clothing to protect him from a lack of privilege and from vulnerability.
Wow, I love that lens. That is fascinating. And it sounds so true in our own society and so easy to think about how it might have played out in Joseph's society. But yeah, exactly that, the way that clothes, first of all, are imposed upon Joseph, but also the way that they are the medium through which he navigates the social ladder, right? Or other people are navigating that social ladder for him. And some of the cultural references you make are so interesting. You know, I know that this discourse is very live in the Black community in America, where an entire community of people have been economically held back, forcefully held back and disadvantaged in society, and don't have fancy houses, or maybe not fancy cars, but dressed to the nines. A certain kind of extravagant dress is a way of saying, this is where I can be royal. This is where I can be beautiful. This is where I can express the fineries. And maybe the opposite is true, is that the person who lives in the mansion, it's like they walk around in sweatpants, right? And that's a privilege to walk around in sweatpants because they don't have to display it for people to know that they have status. And that kind of dynamic exists in the Jewish community as well. These same rabbis who dressed, in fancy regal garments also went home to little shacks, right? So that's a fascinating thing to think about, how Joseph's clothing is also related to his status, wealth, and power, right? We talked about sex and violence and power, but status, wealth, and power as well. Great. Jairo.
Several comments. First of all, I believe that eunuchs can have sex. The only important event that I believe humans can show up naked is at birth. And clothes do make the person. Now, let's go back to the original story. Joseph was in jail. I'm sure he didn't smell very good, and I'm sure his clothes might have been ragged. There's no way that you can make an impression on the Pharaoh by being dressed like that. So of course he had to be groomed. He had to be made to look good. Okay. Now, clothing sometimes defines the function, the roles in society we play. Policemen have uniforms, soldiers have uniforms, nurses and doctors have uniforms. So clothes really are very important because they explain what we do in society. You You can't have a beggar show up at the White House. It just doesn't work.
It's such a fascinating point you make about nakedness, which is another thing we could examine in our tradition. Who is naked, right? Who's the first people to be naked?
Adam and Eve.
The first people, right?
Right.
And then what do they get? Kotnot, or same language there. The garments, the cloak, same language that Joseph gets. That God dresses them at a certain point. Hiro's comments are so fascinating because it is worth thinking as we come to the end of the hour, whether if clothes represent so many things, does that mean that the clothes are representations of something, but the truth is under the clothes? And therefore there's something about nakedness that both symbolically and in some sense very viscerally, like literally, nakedness is a revelation of some kind of true self, which isn't it. I mean, on some level, what Hira is saying is true. When we're in like sexual, intimate situations, there's a greater kind of revelation, and people are seeing things that people usually don't see. But that in itself is bizarre and fascinating. That some essential and true part of ourselves is almost always covered. And we've been talking about clothes style, clothes symbol, but part of it is it covers us. And it serves a function in that way. And I think, we have different kinds of theories about how covered human beings should be, but most societies seem to gravitate towards some kind of covering. So what is that about, right? And then what is nakedness, and how essential is our naked body to our sense of who we quote unquote really are? Okay. All right. We just have time for a couple more comments. I'm going to be sad not to get to everyone, but I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. So keep it compact if you can. I'm going to turn to Kathy next.
Oh, okay. So this is actually very much where I've been thinking, going back to creation and our original nakedness. And, there's a way in which Garden of Eden, it's actually to be naked was the best thing, the most perfect thing was to be naked. And it's really only after, Adam and Eve screw up, literally, make mistakes that then, clothes come in. And I always thought that was so weird that, there should be this, the fatal flaw or whatever, and that the thing that comes up first are clothes. And of course, it's not just the clothes, it's the actual awareness of their nakedness, that before they were naked and in this kind of pure state and this sort of ideal state, but they weren't aware that they were naked. And as soon as they're aware that they're naked, so it's kind of like not just, clothes, but it's this awareness of nakedness. And then where does that take you? It's like, it has something to do with shame, self-awareness, sexuality, certainly. But it seems to me all this business about clothes has to be taken in that context. That really clothes are not the ideal state, or that not necessarily what we're really going for. We're really
there's so much to unpack there. Kathy, I feel like, lives in the Garden of Eden. She's always bringing us back there, and it's great because it's so clear how foundational it is. It sort of tendrils into everything. But you're exactly right that they eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But the first thing that they know is that they are ki aramim hem. That's the first thing they see. And before that, we're told very distinctly that they were naked, velo yitbosheshu, and they weren't ashamed at all. And suddenly they are. In fact, Carrie, if you're there and if you can post the in the chat, the first of the podcasts. I started this new podcast, Best Book Ever. And the first of them was about sort of the other half of this conversation, right? Nakedness, and explored exactly these lines that Kathy is analyzing for us. All right, let's turn to Jane.
Okay, sorry about that. This is one of my favorite books. I don't know if it's reversed or if you can see it.
I see it, The Jewish Wardrobe.
Okay, so this is an exhibit catalog from an Israel Museum exhibit, one of my favorite books. And And there's so many wonderful and amazing things in it, but I just want to hone in on sort of a Rachel and Leah sort of situation here. This is Hasidic wedding garb for the woman, completely covered. And then her husband will reveal herself during the Badekin, just to prove that she's not, that she is Rachel and not Leah, so to speak. Nonetheless, a couple thoughts in terms, I'm going to leave Jacob and go back to Ikar for a second. One of the very first sermons that I heard in 2015 from Rabbi Browse, she threw in, she's talking about clothing and Ikar or something. And I was just getting to know the people there. I didn't know who, what, where. And she mentioned Rabbi Aaron Alexander, who was then, I guess, a dean at UJ, or, you know, the rabbinical school. He was almost as popular as Rabbi Kasher. And he was known, I guess, and she mentioned it, you know, first as someone, an example of those who dress casually to shul. So he would wear shorts to shul all the time. And I guess because, you know, he probably had his way of dressing at work versus when he would go, you know, just wanted to be casual on a Saturday for Shabbat services at Ikar. And a couple of years later, or maybe not that long, he got a job at as the associate rabbi in Washington, D.C. at a very venerable synagogue. And if you follow any pictures of him, you'll see no longer was he wearing the shorts. No, now he was dressing the part. So anyway,
like Joseph, right? He'd been set on the chariot and placed over all the land, right? Yeah, no, right. Yeah. And part of what you're expressing there, which is so, and Jen was expressing it earlier, and other people have, Stephen up at the front expressed this, that our clothing, it's an important point, which we'll return to here at the end. Our clothing is not it's a symbol, it's a representation of something, but it's not one that we are always projecting out of our own choice and agency. It is often imposed upon us, and we are expected to, commanded to, sometimes even forced to display the proper image to fit the context that we are in. And how much Joseph experiences that as a kind of constriction or concealment, and how much Aaron Alexander experiences that as a constriction or a kind of concealment. These are interesting questions. It kills me that I can't get to Ariella and Payam. I'm sorry to miss your hands today. We do have to close, but I just one last image or text for you, which really just amplifies what Matt and others have been saying all along. But we have to just really say it explicitly at the end here as we think about Joseph being constrained or concealed by his clothes rather than intentionally constraining or concealing. That's part of the question and the drama in the Joseph story. How much is he retreating into his Egyptian life and power and role, and how much has he been forced into that? And this all comes to a head when Joseph conceals himself deliberately and his brothers strangely do not recognize him. This is the last text that we'll look at today, but this language of recognition, by the way, has come up before, right? In the garments that Potiphar's wife showed Potiphar, in the garments that Joseph's brothers showed Joseph's father. There's a kind of recognize this. Did he recognize it? And then so that word too becomes a kind of a leitmotif. And so when at the end, towards the end of our Parsha, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger to them. And actually the word there is vayit nakir. He became foreign to them. And he asked them, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to procure food. For though Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible that they didn't recognize him? It's their brother. Now, it's been a long time, but part of it has to be that he's no longer Joseph. He is King Tut, right? He's encased in a kind of sarcophagus of of Egyptian finery. And so the climax of the story comes when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And what does he say? What is the first words that he says? Ani Yosef, I'm Joseph, right? And it seems like somehow he had to say I'm Joseph because whatever's on the outside is not speaking out the truth of who he is. There's something about the clothing that is in fact itself a deception, right? And Joseph is trying to figure out how to be who he is, to reveal his true self into the world. And it's confusing and difficult for him, and clothes are negotiating that delicate tangle that he has with his own desire or lack of desire to self-reveal. And maybe on some level, we all deal with that. And we all think about that as we put on our clothing, or as we put on the clothing that is expected of us in shul, in a job interview. We're thinking about, is this me? Is this who I am? Do I feel like I'm really expressing myself? Or am I being encased in a modern day sarcophagus of the fashion of the day? So we're over time. I'm sorry to those I didn't get to, but we'll leave it. This is obviously a huge topic that we could continue to discuss. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll pick up again with Joseph, the ongoing story of Joseph next week. Wishing everybody Hanukkah Sameach, happy Hanukkah. Hope to see some of you over the rest of the nights of the festival. Love you all. Bye.